For Better or Worse, by W. Jacobs. Mr. George Wotton gently pushed the swing doors of the public bar of the King's Head an inch apart, applied an eye to the aperture in the hope of discovering a moneyed friend. His gaze fell on the only man in the bar, a grey beard of 60, whose weather-beaten face and rough clothing spoke of the sea. With a faint sigh, he widened the opening and passed through. "Morning, Ben," he said with an attempt at cheerfulness. "Have a drop with me," said the other heartily. "Got any money about you?" Mr. Wotton shook his head, and his face fell, clearing somewhat as the other handed him his mug. "Drink it all up, George," he said. His friend complied. A more tactful man might have taken longer over the job, but Mr. Benjamin Davis, who appeared to be labouring under some strong excitement, took no notice. "I've had a shock, George," he said, regarding the other steadily. "I've heard news of my old woman." "Didn't know you had one," said Mr. Wotton calmly. "What's she done?" "She left me," said Mr. Davis solemnly. "She left me 35 years ago. I went off to sea one fine morning, and that was the last I ever see of her." "Why? Did she bolt?" inquired Mr. Wotton with mild interest. "No," said his friend, "but I did. We'd been married 3 years. 3 long years, and I'd had enough of it. Awful temper she had. The last words I ever heard her say was, 'Take that.'" Mr. Wotton took up the mug, and after satisfying himself as to the absence of contents, put it down again and yawned. "Oh, I shouldn't worry about it if I was you," he remarked. "She's hardly likely to find you now, and if she does, she won't get much." Mr. Davis gave vent to a contemptuous laugh. "Get much?" he repeated. "It's her what's got it. I met an old shipmate of mine this morning, what I hadn't seen for 10 years, and he told me he run across her only a month ago. After she left me—" "But you said you left her!" exclaimed his listening friend. "Same thing," said Mr. Davis impatiently. "After she left me to work myself to death at sea, running here and there at the orders of a pack of lazy scuts, aft. She went into service and stayed in one place for 15 years. Then her missus died and left her all her money. For 20 years, while I've been working myself to skin and bone, she's been living in comfort and idleness." "Odd lines," said Mr. Wotton, shaking his head. "It don't bear thinking of." "Why didn't she advertise for me?" said Mr. Davis, raising his voice. "That's what I want to know. Advertisements is cheap enough. Why didn't she advertise? I should have come at once if she'd said anything about money." Mr. Wotton shook his head again. "Perhaps she didn't want you," he said slowly. "What's that got to do with it?" demanded the other. "It was her duty. She got money, and I ought to have had my half of it. Nothing can make up for that wasted 20 years, nothing." "Perhaps she'll take you back," said Mr. Wotton. "Take me back?" repeated Mr. Davis. "Of course she'll take me back. She'll have to. There's a law in the land, ain't there? What I'm thinking of is, can I get back my share, what I ought to have had for the last 20 years? "Get her to take you back first," counselled his friend. 35 years is a long time, and perhaps she's lost her love for you. Was you good-looking in those days?" "Yes," snapped Mr. Davis. "I ain't altered much. Sides, what about her?" "That ain't the question," said the other. "She's got a home and money. It don't matter about her looks, and what's more, she ain't bound to keep you. If you take my advice, you won't dream of letting her know you run away from her. Say you was cast away at sea, and when you came back years afterwards you couldn't find her." Mr. Davis pondered for some time in sulky silence. "Perhaps it would be as well," he said at last, "but I shan't stand no nonsense, mind." "If you like, I'll come with you," said Mr. Wotton. "I ain't got nothing to do. I could tell her I was cast away with you if you liked. Anything to help a pal." Mr. Davis took 2 inches of solid clay pipe from his pocket and puffed thoughtfully. "You can come," he said at last. "If you'd only got a copper or 2, we could ride. It's down Clapham way." Mr. Wotton smiled feebly, and after going carefully through his pocket, shook his head and followed his friend outside. "I wonder whether she'll be pleased," he remarked, as they walked slowly along. "She might be. Women are funny creatures, so faithful. I knew one whose husband used to knock her about dreadful, and after he died she was so true to his memory she wouldn't marry again." Mr. Davis grunted, and with a longing eye at the omnibuses passing over London Bridge, asked a policeman the distance to Clapham. "Never mind," said Mr. Wotton, as his friend uttered an exclamation. "You'll have money in your pocket soon." Mr. Davis's face brightened. "And a watch and chain too," he said. "And smoke your cigar of a Sunday," said Mr. Wotton. "And have a easy chair and a glass for a friend." Mr. Davis almost smiled, and then, suddenly remembering his wasted 20 years, shook his head grimly over the friendship that attached itself to easy chairs and glasses of ale, and said that there was plenty of it about. More friendship than glasses of ale and easy chairs, perhaps. At Clapham, they inquired the way of a small boy, and after following the road indicated, retraced their steps, cheered by a faint but bloodthirsty hope of meeting him again. A friendly baker put them on the right track at last, both gentlemen eyeing the road with a mixture of concern and delight. It was a road of trim semi-detached villas, each with a well-kept front garden and neatly curtained windows. At the gate of a house with the word Blair Gowrie inscribed in huge gilt letters on the fanlight, Mr. Davis paused for a moment uneasily, and then walking up the path, followed by Mr. Wotton, knocked at the door. He retired a step in disorder before the apparition of a maid in cap and apron. A sharp "Not today!" sounded in his ears, and the door closed again. He faced his friend, gasping. "I should give her the sack first thing," said Mr. Wotton. Mr. Davis knocked again, and again. The maid reappeared, and after surveying them through the glass, opened the door a little way, and parleyed. "I want to see your missus," said Mr. Davis fiercely. "What for?" demanded the girl. "You tell her," said Mr. Davis, inserting his foot just in time, "you tell her that there's 2 gentlemen here what have brought her news of her husband, and look sharp about it." "They was cast away with him," said Mr. Wotton. "On a desert island," said Mr. Davis. He pushed his way in, followed by his friend, and a head that had been leaning over the banisters was suddenly withdrawn. For a moment he stood irresolute in the tiny passage, and then, with a husband's boldness, he entered the front room and threw himself into an easy chair. Mr. Wotton, after a scared glance around the well-furnished room, seated himself on the extreme edge of the most uncomfortable chair he could find, and coughed nervously. "Better not be too sudden with her," he whispered. "You don't want her to faint or anything of that sort. Don't let her know who you are at first. Let her find it out for herself." Mr. Davis, who was also suffering from the stiff grandeur of his surroundings, nodded. "Perhaps you'd better start in case she recognises my voice," he said slowly. "Pitch it in strong about me, and I was always wondering what had happened to her." "You're in luck, that's what you are," said his friend enviously. "I've only seen furniture like this in shop windows before. Hush! Here she comes." He started, and both men tried to look at their ease as a stiff rustling sounded from the stairs. Then the door opened, and a tall, stoutly built old lady with white hair swept into the room and stood regarding them. Mr. Davis, unprepared for the changes wrought by 35 years, stared at her aghast. The black silk dress, the gold watch chain, and huge cameo brooch did not help to reassure him. Good afternoon, ma'am," said Mr. Wotton in a thin voice. The old lady returned the greeting, and crossing to a chair, and seating herself in a very upright fashion, regarded him calmly. We called to see you about a dear old pal, friend, I mean," continued Mr. Wotton. "One of the best. The best." "Yes," said the old lady. "He's been missing," said Mr. Wotton, watching closely for any symptoms of fainting, For 35 years. 35 years ago, very much against his wish, he left his young and handsome wife to go for a sea voyage and was shipwrecked and cast away on a desert island. Yes, said the old lady again. I was cast away with him, said Mr. Wotton. Both of us was cast away with him. He indicated Mr. Davis with his hand, and the old lady, after a glance at that gentleman, turned to Mr. Wotton again. We was on that island for longer than I like to think of, continued Mr. Wotton, who had a wholesome dread of dates. But we was rescued at last, and ever since then he's been hunting high and low for his wife. It's very interesting, murmured the old lady, but what has it got to do with me? Mr. Wotton gasped and cast a helpless glance at his friend. You ain't heard his name yet, he said impressively. What would you say if I said it was Ben Davis? I should say it wasn't true, said the old lady promptly. Not true, said Mr. Wotton, catching his breath painfully. Oh, wish I may die. About the desert island, continued the old lady calmly, the story that I heard was that he went off like a cur and left his young wife to do the best she could for herself. I suppose he's heard since that she's come in for a bit of money. Money? Repeated Mr. Wotton, in a voice that he fondly hoped expressed artless surprise. Money? Money, said the old lady. And I suppose he sent you two gentlemen round to see how the land lay. She was looking full at Mr. Davis as she spoke, and both men began to take a somewhat sombre view of the situation. You didn't know him, else you wouldn't talk like that, said Mr. Wotton. I don't suppose you'd know him if you was to see him now. I don't suppose I should, said the other. Perhaps you'd recognise his voice, said Mr. Davis, breaking silence at last. Mr. Wotton held his breath, but the old lady merely shook her head thoughtfully. It was a disagreeable voice when his wife used to hear it, she said at last. Always fault-finding when he wasn't swearing. Mr. Wotton glanced at his friend and, raising his eyebrows slightly, gave up his task. Might have been faults on both sides, said Mr. Davis gruffly. You weren't all that you should have been, you know. Me? Said his hostess, raising her voice. Yes, you, said Mr. Davis, rising. Don't you know me, Mary? Why, I knew you the moment you come into the room. He moved towards her awkwardly, but she rose in her turn and drew back. If you touch me, I'll scream, she said firmly. How dare you? Why, I've never seen you before in my life. It's Ben Davis, ma'am. It's him right enough, said Mr. Wotton meekly. Hold your tongue, said the old lady. Look at me, commanded Mr. Davis sternly. Look at me straight in the eye. Don't talk nonsense, said the other sharply. Look you in the eye, indeed. I don't want to look you in your eye. What would people think? Let 'em think what they like, said Mr. Davis recklessly. This is a nice homecoming after being away 35 years. Most of it on a desert island, put in Mr. Wotton pathetically. And now I've come back, resumed Mr. Davis. Come back to stop. He hung his cap on a vase on the mantelpiece that reeled under the shock, and dropping into his chair again, crossed his legs and eyed her sternly. Her gaze was riveted on his dilapidated boots. She looked up and spoke mildly. You're not my husband, she said. You've made a mistake. I think you'd better go. Oh, said Mr. Davis with a hard laugh. Indeed, and how do you know I'm not? For the best of reasons, was the reply. Besides, how can you prove that you are? 35 years is a long time. Especially on a desert island, said Mr. Wotton rapidly. You'd be surprised how slow the time passes. I was there with him, and I can lay my hand on my heart and assure you that that is your husband. Nonsense, said the old lady vigorously. Rubbish. I can prove it, said Mr. Davis, fixing her with a glittering eye. Do you remember the serpent I had tattooed on my leg for a garter? If you don't go at once, said the old lady hastily, I'll send for the police. You used to admire it, said Mr. Davis reproachfully. I remember once. If you say another word, said the other in a fierce voice, I'll send straight off for the police. You and your serpents. I'll tell my husband of you, that's what I'll do. Your what? Roared Mr. Davis, springing to his feet. My husband. He won't stand any of your nonsense, I can tell you. You better go before he comes in. Oh, said Mr. Davis, taking a long breath. Oh, so you been and got married again, have you? That's your love for your husband, as was cast away while trying to earn a living for you. That's why you don't want me, is it? We'll see. I'll wait for him. You don't know what you're talking about, said the other with great dignity. I've only been married once. Mr. Davis passed the back of his hand across his eyes in a dazed fashion and stared at her. Is somebody passing himself off as me? He demanded. Because if he is, I'll have you both up for bigamy. Certainly not. But... Mr. Davis turned and looked blankly at his friend. Mr. Wotton met his gaze with dilated eyes. You say you recognise me as your wife, said the old lady. Certainly, said Mr. Davis hotly. It's very curious, said the other. Very. But are you sure? Look again. Mr. Davis thrust his face close to hers and stared hard. She bore his scrutiny without flinching. I'm positive certain, said Mr. Davis, taking a breath. That's very curious, said the old lady. But then I suppose we are a bit alike. You see, Mrs. Davis being away, I'm looking after her house for a bit. My name happens to be Smith. Mr. Davis uttered a sharp exclamation, and falling back a step stared at her open-mouthed. We all make mistakes, urged Mr. Wotton after a long silence, and Ben's sight ain't what it used to be. He strained it looking out for a sail when we was on that desert. When'll she be back? Inquired Mr. Davis, finding his voice at last. The old lady affected to look puzzled. But I thought you were certain that I was your wife, she said smoothly. My mistake, said Mr. Davis ruefully. 35 years is a long time and people change a bit. I have myself. For one thing, I must say I didn't expect to find her so stout. Stout, repeated the other quickly. Not that I mean you're too stout, said Mr. Davis hurriedly. For people that like stoutness, that is. My wife used to have a very good figure. Mr. Wotton nodded. He used to rave about it on that When will she be back? Inquired Mr. Davis, interrupting him. Mrs. Smith shook her head. I can't say, she replied, moving towards the door. When she's off holidaying, I never know when she'll return. Shall I tell her you called? Tell her Certainly, said Mr. Davis with great vehemence. I'll come in a week's time and see if she's back. She might be away for months, said the old lady, moving slowly to the passage and opening the street door. Good afternoon. She closed the door behind them and stood watching them through the glass as they passed disconsolately into the street. Then she went back into the parlour and, standing before the mantelpiece, looked long and earnestly into the mirror. Mr. Davis returned a week later, alone, and pausing at the gate, glanced in dismay at a bill in the window announcing that the house was to be sold. He walked up the path, still looking at it, and being admitted by the trim servant, was shown into the parlour and stood in a dispirited fashion before Mrs. Smith. Not back yet? He inquired gruffly. The old lady shook her head. What is that bill for? Demanded Mr. Davis, jerking his thumb towards it. She's thinking of selling the house, said Mrs. Smith. I let her know you'd been, and that is the result. She won't come back. You won't see her again. Where is she? Inquired Mr. Davis, frowning. Mrs. Smith shook her head again. And it would be no use my telling you, she said. What she has got is her own, and the law won't let you touch a penny of it without her consent. You must have treated her badly. Why did you leave her? Why? Repeated Mr. Davis. Why? Why, because she hit me over the head with a broom handle. Mrs. Smith tossed her head. Fancy remembering that for 35 years, she said. Fancy forgetting it, retorted Mr. Davis. I suppose she had a hot temper, said the old lady. Hot temper, said the other. Yes, He leaned forward and, holding his chilled hands over the fire, stood for some time deep in thought. "I don't know what it is," he said at last, "but there's a something about you that reminds me of her. It ain't your voice, 'cause she had a very nice voice when she wasn't in a temper, and it ain't your face because—" "Yes," said Mrs. Smith sharply, "because it don't remind me of her. And yet the other day you said you recognised me at once," said the old lady. "I thought I did," said Mr. Davis. "One thing is, I was expecting to see her, I suppose." There was a long silence. "Well, I won't keep you," said Mrs. Smith at last, "and it's no good for you to keep coming here to see her. She will never come here again. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but you don't look over and above respectable. Your coat is torn, your trousers are patched in a dozen places, and your boots are half off your feet. I don't know what the servant must think." I only came to look for my wife," said Mr. Davis in a startled voice. "I won't come again." "That's right," said the old lady. "That'll please her, I know. And if she should happen to ask what sort of a living you are making, what shall I tell her?" "Tell her what you said about my clothes, ma'am," said Mr. Davis, with his hand on the doorknob. "She'll understand then. She's known what it is to be poor herself. She'd got a bad temper, but she'd have cut her tongue out afore she'd have thrown a poor devil's rags in his face. Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Ben," said the old woman in a changed voice. Mr. Davis, halfway through the door, started as though he had been shot, and facing about, stood eyeing her in dumb bewilderment. "It isn't the same voice, and it isn't the same face," said the old woman. "But if I'd only got a broom handle handy—" Mr. Davis made an odd noise in his throat. "If you hadn't been so down on your luck," said his wife, blinking her eyes rapidly, "I'd have let you go. If you hadn't looked so miserable, I could have stood it. If I take you back, are you going to behave yourself?" Mr. Davis stood gaping at her. "If I take you back again," repeated his wife, speaking very slowly, "are you going to behave yourself?" "Yes," said Mr. Davis, finding his voice at last. "Yes, if you are."